In a quiet little town surrounded by lush green hills and sprawling fields, there lived an elderly man named Harold. His house was modest, a small cottage with white walls, a red brick chimney, and flower beds bursting with daisies and marigolds. To anyone passing by, Harold might have seemed like just another old man enjoying his retirement. But those who knew him understood that behind his calm demeanor lay a lifetime of courage, sacrifice, and stories untold. Harold had once been a soldier, a proud member of the armed forces who served his country during some of its most challenging times. He fought in battles far away from home, endured harsh conditions, and witnessed things no human should ever see. Yet, despite the hardships, Harold never lost sight of why he chose to serve, to protect the freedom and safety of others. Over the years, he earned medals for bravery and leadership. But when the war ended, Harold returned home without seeking recognition or fame. Instead, he quietly slipped back into civilian life, choosing to focus on simpler pleasures: gardening, reading books, and occasionally fishing at the nearby lake. Every morning, Harold would wake up early, brew himself a cup of strong black tea, and sit by the window overlooking his garden. The sun would rise slowly over the hills, casting golden light across the dew-covered grass. It was during these peaceful moments that Harold often found himself thinking about the past, the friends he made, the lives lost, and the promises he kept to honor their memory. Though decades had passed since his time in uniform, Harold still carried the weight of those memories with him. They weren't burdensome. Rather, they reminded him of the bond he shared with fellow soldiers and the values they stood for. One crisp autumn morning, as leaves turned shades of orange and gold, Harold felt an unusual pull toward something bigger than his daily routine. There was an announcement in the local newspaper about a special event being held at the Royal Palace, a ceremony dedicated to honoring veterans and celebrating their contributions to the nation. At first, Harold hesitated. He wasn't one for crowds or ceremonies, preferring solitude over public gatherings. But then he thought about all the men and women who didn't make it back, the ones whose names were etched on memorials and whispered in prayers. Maybe, he reasoned, attending this event could be his way of paying tribute not only to them but also to the younger generation who might not fully understand the sacrifices made by those who came before. With newfound determination, Harold decided to go. He dug out his old suit from the closet, polished his shoes, and carefully placed his veteran's badge in his pocket. Before leaving, he took one last look at the framed photograph hanging on his wall, a picture of him and his squad, taken many years ago. Their faces were young and full of hope, unaware of what lay ahead. "I won't forget you," Harold murmured softly, touching the glass frame. Then, grabbing his hat and cane, he stepped outside into the cool morning air. The journey to the IR city was long but pleasant. As the bus wound its way through picturesque countryside, Harold gazed out the window, watching fields give way to suburbs and eventually towering buildings. Memories flooded his mind, memories of marching drills, late-night conversations under starlit skies, and the camaraderie that came with serving alongside people who became family. By the time the bus pulled into the bustling city center, Harold felt a mix of excitement and nostalgia. When he finally arrived at the Royal Palace, the scene before him took his breath away. The grand structure stood majestically against the clear blue sky, its intricate architecture and golden accents gleaming in the sunlight. People milled about, chatting excitedly, while children ran around waving tiny flags. Despite the cheerful atmosphere, Harold couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. So much had changed since his days in the service, yet certain things remained constant: the pride in duty, the respect for sacrifice, and the enduring spirit of unity. As Harold approached the entrance, he noticed the royal guards stationed at the gates. Dressed in their iconic crimson tunics and towering bearskin hats, they stood perfectly still, exuding an aura of strength and discipline. Harold paused for a moment, taking in the sight. These young men and women represented everything he once believed in, the ideals of loyalty, honor, and selflessness. Watching them stirred something deep within him, a connection to a legacy he had helped build. Little did he know, this visit to the palace would lead to a moment that would touch hearts far beyond what he could imagine. As Harold stood near the entrance of the royal palace, his eyes were drawn to one particular guard. This young man, tall and sturdy in his crimson uniform, seemed different somehow. Perhaps it was the way he held himself. Shoulders squared, chin up, yet with a subtle softness in his gaze that hinted at something deeper beneath the surface. Or maybe it was the faint resemblance to some of the soldiers Harold had once commanded. Young faces full of determination, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The crowd around him buzzed with excitement, families chatting and children pointing at the guards with wide-eyed wonder. But Harold wasn't paying attention to any of that. His focus was entirely on this one guard, whose presence reminded him so vividly of his own days in service. Memories came flooding back. The camaraderie, the shared jokes during long marches, the quiet moments when no words were needed because everyone understood the unspoken bond they shared. For a brief moment, Harold felt as though time had folded in on itself, bringing him back to those years when he too stood watch, protecting what mattered most. Overwhelmed by emotion, Harold realized he wanted to acknowledge this young guard, not just as a stranger in uniform, but as someone who represented everything Harold believed in. Slowly, deliberately, Harold stepped forward. He removed his hat, holding it gently in his hands, and raised his right hand in a crisp salute. It wasn't just any salute. It was the kind taught only through years of discipline and experience, the kind that carried meaning far beyond its simple gesture. Every muscle in Harold's arm remembered how to move, even though decades had passed since he last performed such an act. His hand trembled slightly as it hovered near his forehead, weathered by age but still steady with purpose. The salute was more than a sign of respect. It was a bridge connecting two generations, 2 lifetimes of service. Harold's heart swelled with pride as he held the position, his eyes fixed firmly on the guard. In that moment, nothing else existed. The noise of the crowd faded into the background, leaving only the silent exchange between these two men, separated by years, but united by duty. To Harold's surprise, and to the astonishment of everyone, nearby, the guard did not remain motionless as protocol dictated. Instead, after a brief hesitation, the young man lowered his rifle ever so slightly and stepped out of formation. Gasps rippled through the crowd as people turned to watch, unsure of what was happening. Breaking rank was unheard of for royal guards whose training emphasized strict adherence to rules above all else. Yet here was this soldier, stepping forward with deliberate care, his movements precise and respectful. The guard met Harold's gaze, his expression solemn yet warm. Without saying a word, he raised his own hand in a perfect salute, one that mirrored Harold's in every way. The gesture was flawless, executed with the same level of precision and reverence that Harold had shown. For a few seconds, the two men stood there, locked in mutual respect, their salutes bridging the gap between past and present. Then, leaning down slightly toward Harold, the guard spoke in a voice low enough to avoid drawing undue attention, but clear enough for Harold to hear. "Thank you for your service, sir," the guard said, his tone filled with genuine gratitude. Those 6 simple words carried immense weight, resonating deeply within Harold. They weren't rehearsed or obligatory. They came from a place of understanding, perhaps even personal connection. Harold felt his throat tighten as tears welled up in his eyes. He hadn't expected this. No one had. And yet, in that fleeting moment, Harold knew he was being seen, not just as an old man standing outside a palace, but as a veteran who had given so much of himself for his country. The guard straightened back up, returning to his original position as if nothing unusual had occurred. But the impact of his actions lingered in the air, heavy and profound. People nearby began whispering among themselves, pointing at Harold and the guard, their voices tinged with awe and admiration. Some clutched their chests, visibly moved by what they had witnessed. Others quickly pulled out their phones to capture the scene, knowing instinctively that this was a moment worth remembering. For Harold, the world seemed to pause, All the years of sacrifice, the battles fought, the friends lost. It all came rushing back, but this time accompanied by a sense of validation. Here was proof that his service hadn't been forgotten, that it continued to matter even in a rapidly changing world. The guard's acknowledgement wasn't just about him. It was about every soldier who had ever worn a uniform, every family who had waited anxiously for loved ones to return, every life touched by the sacrifices made in the name of peace. Harold slowly lowered his hand, breaking the salute, and nodded at the guard. Words failed him, but the look in his eyes conveyed everything he couldn't say aloud. Gratitude, respect, pride. The guard responded with a slight nod of his own, his posture regaining its usual rigidity as he resumed his post. Though the interaction lasted mere seconds, its effects rippled outward, touching everyone who bore witness to it. As Harold took a step back, composing himself, he noticed the reactions of those around him. A young mother held her child close, explaining softly why the moment was so special. An older couple exchanged glances, their expressions reflecting memories of their own wartime experiences. Even the other guards, bound by tradition and protocol, seemed unable to mask the emotions flickering across their faces. One of them shifted slightly, adjusting his grip on his rifle, while another blinked rapidly, as if trying to hold back tears. What had started as an ordinary day outside the royal palace had transformed into something extraordinary. Harold's spontaneous salute and the guard's unexpected response created a ripple effect, reminding everyone present of the enduring power of respect and gratitude. As the ceremony prepared to begin, Harold found himself smiling faintly, his heart lighter than it had been in years. Whatever happened next, he knew one thing for certain: this moment would stay with him forever, a testament to the bonds forged through service and sacrifice. The moment the guard stepped out of formation and returned Harold's salute, the atmosphere around the royal palace shifted dramatically. What had been a lively buzz of conversation and laughter turned into an almost sacred silence, as if time itself had paused to honor what was unfolding. People who had been casually milling about suddenly froze in place, their attention riveted on the elderly veteran and the young guard. Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by murmurs of disbelief and awe. For many spectators, the scene was surreal. Royal guards were known for their unwavering discipline and adherence to protocol. They stood like statues, unmoving and unyielding, no matter what happened around them. It was part of their role to embody strength, stability, and tradition. So when this particular guard broke rank, it wasn't just surprising. It felt deeply symbolic, as though he was stepping outside the boundaries of duty to acknowledge something greater. The crowd didn't know whether to cheer, clap, or simply stand in stunned silence. Some instinctively reached for their phones to capture the moment, while others simply stared, too overwhelmed to react. As the guard whispered his heartfelt words, "Thank you for your service, sir," the emotional weight of the exchange became palpable. Harold, still holding his hat in trembling hands, looked up at the young man with tears glistening in his eyes. His face softened, the years of weariness and quiet reflection melting away under the warmth of recognition. For so long, Harold had carried the memories of war and loss alone, rarely speaking about his experiences unless prompted. But now, standing before this guard, he felt seen, not just as an old man, but as someone who had once stood where the four guard stood, protecting freedoms and ideals that others might take for granted. The impact of the moment spread quickly among the onlookers. A young woman standing nearby began to cry softly, clutching her toddler closer to her chest. When asked by a friend why she was so moved, she explained haltingly that her grandfather had also been a veteran. "He never talked much about the war," she said, wiping her eyes with the sleeve of her jacket. "But I remember how proud he was of his service, even though it haunted him sometimes. Seeing this, it's like they're honoring him too." Her voice cracked and she turned away, unable to continue. Nearby, an older couple exchanged meaningful glances, their expressions heavy with shared memories. The man reached out to take his wife's hand, squeezing it gently. "It reminds me of my brother," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "He didn't come back. Moments like this make you realize how important it is to remember them, all of them." His wife nodded silently, her own eyes filling with tears. Around them, similar stories began to surface. Strangers introduced themselves to one another, sharing fragments of their family histories. Fathers, uncles, brothers, and sisters who had served in wars both recent and distant. The guard's simple act of breaking protocol had opened a floodgate of emotions, connecting people through their collective pasts. Even the other royal guards, bound by strict rules of conduct, couldn't remain entirely stoic. Though their faces remained impassive, small details betrayed their inner reactions. One guard blinked more frequently than usual, as if trying to hold back tears. Another adjusted his grip on his rifle, perhaps using the motion to steady himself emotionally. The subtle shifts in their expressions spoke volumes, revealing that they too understood the significance of what had just occurred. They may not have been able to step out of line themselves, but their eyes followed the interaction closely, and their postures seemed slightly less rigid afterward, as if the moment had humanized them, reminding them of the real-world implications of the duties they performed every day. As the initial shock wore off, the crowd erupted into spontaneous applause. At first it was hesitant, a smattering of claps here and there, but soon it grew louder and more unified, echoing off the stone walls of the palace. People cheered, some whistling or calling out words of gratitude. Children mimicked their parents' gestures, clapping enthusiastically without fully understanding why. The sound filled the air, a cacophony of appreciation and admiration that seemed to lift everyone's spirits. Even those who hadn't witnessed the exact exchange between Harold and the guard joined in, sensing that something extraordinary had taken place. Harold, still standing near the entrance, found himself at the center of this outpouring of emotion. He hadn't expected any of this, certainly not the guard's response nor the overwhelming reaction from the crowd. As the applause washed over him, he felt a strange mixture of humility and pride. Humility because he knew he wasn't the only one deserving of such recognition. Countless others had served alongside him, many of whom had paid the ultimate price. Pride because in this moment he realized that their sacrifices hadn't been forgotten. Not by the guard, not by the crowd, and not by the nation they had fought to protect. The guard, having returned to his position, resumed his stoic stance, but there was a noticeable change in his demeanor. His posture, while still rigid, seemed infused with a newfound sense of purpose. Occasionally his gaze would flicker toward Harold, as if ensuring that the elderly veteran was okay. Though his face betrayed nothing, his eyes told a different story, one of respect, empathy, and gratitude. It was clear that this encounter had affected him deeply, perhaps reminding him of why he chose to serve in the first place. Meanwhile, reporters and photographers stationed at the event scrambled to document the incident. Cameras flashed repeatedly, capturing images of Harold and the guard from every angle. Journalists jotted down notes furiously, eager to piece together the story behind the unexpected interaction. Within minutes, snippets of the event began circulating online, sparking conversations across social media platforms. Hashtags like "Respect for Veterans" and "Guard Breaks Protocol" trended rapidly, drawing attention from people far beyond the palace grounds. The image of Harold saluting the guard and the guard stepping out of formation to return the gesture became a symbol of unity, respect, and gratitude. Back in the crowd, individuals continued to share their thoughts and feelings. A teenage boy, visibly moved, turned to his father and asked, "Why did the guard do that? Isn't he supposed to stay still?" His father knelt down to meet his son's eye level, explaining patiently, "Sometimes doing the right thing means going against the rules. That guard saw a hero and wanted to show respect. It's about recognizing the people who sacrificed, so we can live freely." The boy nodded thoughtfully, his young mind processing the lesson. Moments like these highlighted how powerful acts of kindness and acknowledgement could transcend generations, teaching valuable lessons about honor and gratitude. By the time the ceremony officially began, the energy in the air had shifted completely. What started as a formal gathering transformed into something far more personal and profound. Attendees filed into the palace courtyard, still buzzing with excitement and emotion. Conversations revolved around the earlier interaction, with people marveling at its simplicity and depth. Even those who hadn't been close enough to witness it firsthand felt its effects, thanks to the palpable sense of connection that lingered among the crowd. For Harold, the experience was transformative. As he made his way inside the palace, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was carrying something precious with him, not just the memory of the guard's salute, but the collective gratitude of everyone present. It was as though the entire nation had paused for a brief moment to say thank you, and Harold, humbled yet proud, accepted it on behalf of all those who had served. Little did he know, this was only the beginning of a journey that would bring even more meaning to his life and inspire countless others along the way. After the unexpected and deeply moving exchange between Harold and the royal guard, the ceremony inside the palace began. The grand courtyard was adorned with flags fluttering in the breeze, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the somber yet celebratory mood of the attendees. Rows of chairs had been arranged neatly, and people filed in quietly, still buzzing with emotion from what they had just witnessed outside. Harold, now seated among other veterans and dignitaries, felt a strange mix of pride and humility as he looked around at the sea of faces. The event opened with speeches from high-ranking officials, each one expressing gratitude for the sacrifices made by those who served their country. While these words were heartfelt, they weren't unusual. Such ceremonies often included similar sentiments, but today something was different. Every mention of duty, honor, or sacrifice seemed to carry extra weight, resonating more deeply because of what had happened moments earlier. The audience listened intently, many nodding along or dabbing at their eyes with tissues. For Harold, the speeches felt almost like an echo of his own thoughts, a reminder that the values he once fought for remained alive and cherished. As the program progressed, Harold found himself reflecting on how far society had come since his days in uniform. Back then, veterans returning home didn't always receive the warm welcome they deserved. Some struggled to reintegrate into civilian life, facing indifference or even hostility. Harold remembered the loneliness of those early years after the war, when it felt as though no one truly understood what he and his comrades had endured. Yet here, in this moment, surrounded by people who clearly cared, Harold realized how much attitudes had shifted over time. Society hadn't forgotten its heroes. It had simply learned to honor them better. Midway through the ceremony, an announcement was made that caught everyone by surprise. Harold was invited to share his story. A hush fell over the crowd as he rose slowly from his seat, leaning slightly on his cane for support. His steps were deliberate but steady as he walked toward the podium, the sound of his shoes tapping against the stone floor filling the silence. When he finally stood before the microphone, Harold took a deep breath, surveying the room filled with expectant faces. He wasn't accustomed to public speaking, but he knew this was an opportunity to speak not only for himself, but also for all those who couldn't be there. Harold began by thanking everyone for their presence, his voice calm but tinged with emotion. "I never expected to be asked to speak today," he admitted, pausing briefly to gather his thoughts. "But if sharing my story helps remind us of why we're here, then I'll do my best." With that, he launched into a recounting of his experiences, his enlistment as a young man eager to serve, the friendships forged during training, and the harrowing realities of combat. He spoke of nights spent under starlit skies, sharing laughter and dreams with fellow soldiers, and mornings marred by loss and heartbreak. His words painted vivid pictures of both the beauty and brutality of war. He described the camaraderie that formed among troops, the unspoken understanding that bound them together, and the pain of losing friends who became like family. At times his voice wavered, and he paused to compose himself, gripping the edges of the podium tightly. But even in moments of vulnerability, Harold's delivery remained powerful, drawing listeners further into his world. When Harold recounted the sacrifices made by his comrades, the room grew eerily quiet. You could hear the occasional sniffle or rustle of clothing as people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, moved by the raw honesty of his words. One woman sitting near the front clutched her husband's hand tightly, tears streaming down her face. A teenage boy, perhaps inspired by Harold's courage, leaned forward in his chair, hanging onto every word. Even the officials seated on stage appeared visibly affected, some jotting notes while others wiped away tears. Toward the end of his speech, Harold turned his focus to the present day. "We've come a long way since I first put on that uniform," he said, gesturing toward the crowd. "Back then, not everyone understood what we went through, but look at you all now, honoring us, remembering us. That means more than I can put into words." His gaze lingered on the young royal guard, who had stepped out of formation earlier, and for a brief second, their eyes met. The guard gave a slight nod, acknowledging Harold's gratitude without breaking his disciplined stance. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. Harold concluded his remarks by emphasizing the importance of keeping memories alive. "Never forget those who gave everything so we could live freely," he urged, his voice firm despite the tremor of age. "Tell their stories. Teach your children about their sacrifices, because when we remember them, we keep their spirit alive." As he stepped away from the podium, the audience erupted into thunderous applause. People rose to their feet, cheering and clapping, their admiration evident in every clap and cheer. Harold bowed his head modestly, overwhelmed by the response, but grateful for the chance to share his story. Following the ceremony, Harold was approached by numerous attendees eager to thank him personally. Some shook his hand, others hugged him, and a few simply expressed their gratitude through tearful smiles. Among them was the young guard who had broken protocol earlier. Now off duty, he introduced himself as Corporal James Calloway. Standing taller than Harold, James extended his hand, which Harold accepted warmly. "I wanted to tell you how much your service inspires me," James said earnestly, his voice sincere. "My grandfather was a veteran too. Hearing your story reminds me of him and of why I chose to serve." Harold nodded, touched by the connection. "You're doing good work," he replied, patting James lightly on the shoulder. "Keep honoring those who came before you and you'll make them proud." Their conversation drew curious glances from others nearby, including journalists eager to capture the interaction. Reporters swarmed around Harold, asking questions about his experiences and his thoughts on the day's events. Cameras flashed repeatedly, capturing images of Harold alongside James, their contrasting ages symbolizing the passing of the torch from one generation to the next. Social media platforms lit up with posts about the unlikely friendship forming between the elderly veteran and the young guard, sparking conversations about legacy, respect, and the enduring bonds of service. By the time the event concluded, Harold felt exhausted but fulfilled. He had arrived at the palace expecting nothing more than a quiet afternoon of remembrance. Instead, he left with renewed purpose and a deeper sense of belonging. The ceremony, and the interactions surrounding it, had reminded him that his sacrifices and those of his comrades were not forgotten. They lived on in the hearts of strangers, in the actions of young guards willing to break protocol, and in the collective memory of a grateful nation. As Harold boarded the bus back to his hometown, he carried with him not just the echoes of applause, but also the knowledge that his story mattered. It wasn't just his anymore. It belonged to everyone who had been touched by his words and actions that day. And as the bus rumbled along the winding roads, Harold allowed himself a small smile, knowing that the legacy of service would continue to inspire future generations. When Harold finally returned home, the quiet familiarity of his cottage felt both comforting and surreal. The day's events replayed in his mind like a vivid film, each moment etched deeply into his memory. He hung up his suit carefully in the closet, polished his shoes one last time, and placed his veteran's badge back on the shelf. But as he sat down by the window overlooking his garden, he couldn't shake the feeling that something inside him had shifted. The weight of years seemed lighter now, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. The following days brought an unexpected wave of attention. News outlets picked up the story of Harold and Corporal James Calloway, turning their brief but profound encounter into a symbol of gratitude, respect, and unity. Social media buzzed with posts about the elderly veteran who saluted a royal guard, only for the guard to step out of formation and return the gesture. Photos of the two men were shared, thousands of times accompanied by captions like, "A moment that restores faith and respect across generations." People from all walks of life chimed in, sharing their own stories of loved ones who had served or expressing admiration for the humanity displayed in such a simple act. Harold, initially surprised by the attention, soon found himself embracing it, not for personal gain but because it gave him an opportunity to keep the memories of his comrades alive. Journalists called requesting interviews, schools invited him to speak at assemblies, and local community centers organized events in his honor. At first, Harold hesitated, unsure if he was the right person to represent so many others, but then he realized that saying yes wasn't just about him. It was about ensuring that future generations understood the sacrifices made by those who came before them. One evening, Harold received a letter that touched him deeply. It was from a young boy named Ethan, who had seen the news coverage and been inspired by Harold's story. In neat, childish handwriting, Ethan wrote, "Dear Mr. Harold, thank you for being brave. My dad says you're a hero. I want to be brave like you when I grow up." Enclosed was a drawing of a soldier standing next to a palace, surrounded by stars and hearts. Harold smiled as he read the note, realizing how far-reaching the impact of that single moment outside the palace truly was. Determined to respond personally, Harold sat down and penned a reply, encouraging Ethan to always stand up for what is right and to cherish the freedoms protected by those who serve. As weeks turned into months, Harold became more involved in his community. He began visiting schools, libraries, and veterans groups, sharing not only his wartime experiences but also lessons about resilience, teamwork, and the importance of remembering history. His talks weren't just lectures. They were heartfelt conversations meant to connect with people on a personal level. Whether speaking to teenagers scrolling through their phones or elderly neighbors reminiscing about their own service, Harold tailored his message to resonate with each audience. His ability to make people feel seen and valued earned him widespread affection and respect. Meanwhile, Corporal James Calloway also found himself changed by the experience. Though his decision to break protocol had sparked controversy within military circles, it ultimately led to meaningful discussions about the balance between tradition and compassion. James faced some initial scrutiny from superiors, but public support quickly overshadowed any criticism. Letters poured in praising his actions, with many calling him a role model for modern soldiers. Inspired by Harold's humility and dedication, James decided to use his platform to advocate for veterans' causes. Together, he and Harold formed an unlikely partnership, working to bridge the gap between generations and foster greater understanding between civilians and the armed forces. Their collaboration culminated in a special initiative called Legacy Lives On, aimed at preserving the stories of veterans and educating younger generations about the realities of war and service. Through workshops, storytelling sessions, and even a documentary project, Harold and James worked tirelessly to ensure that no sacrifice would ever be forgotten. The program gained traction nationwide, drawing participants from all corners of society. Veterans found solace in sharing their experiences, while younger audiences learned valuable lessons about courage, empathy, and the enduring cost of freedom. Back in his hometown, Harold noticed subtle changes in the way people interacted with him. Neighbors who once exchanged polite greetings now stopped to chat longer, asking thoughtful questions about his past. Children waved enthusiastically whenever they saw him walking through the park, shouting, "Hi, Mr. Harold." Strangers approached him in stores to express gratitude, often recounting how his story had inspired them to reconnect with family members who had served. For Harold, these small gestures reinforced the idea that every individual has the power to create ripples of kindness and understanding. On a crisp spring morning several months after the ceremony, Harold stood once again at the edge of his garden, gazing out at the blossoming flowers. This time, however, he wasn't alone. A group of children from the local school had come to visit, eager to meet the man whose story had captured their imaginations. They brought handmade cards and drawings, presenting them to Harold with wide-eyed excitement. One little girl shyly handed him a bouquet of wildflowers she had picked herself, her cheeks flushed pink. "Thank you for protecting our country," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. Harold knelt down to her level, his eyes twinkling with warmth. "You're very welcome," he replied softly. "But remember, protecting our country isn't just about fighting wars. It's about looking out for each other, standing up for what's right, and never forgetting where we came from." Children nodded earnestly, hanging onto his words as though they were treasures. That evening, as Harold settled into his favorite chair by the window, he reflected on the journey that had unfolded since that fateful day at the palace. What started as a spontaneous salute had grown into something much larger, a movement rooted in gratitude, connection, and remembrance. Harold knew he wouldn't live forever, but he took comfort in knowing that his legacy, and the legacies of those he served alongside, would endure. Future generations would carry the torch, guided by the stories and values passed down through acts of courage and compassion. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow across the hills, Harold allowed himself a moment of quiet, pride. He thought about the young guard who had stepped out of line to honor him, the countless strangers who had reached out to express gratitude, and the children now learning about sacrifice and service. In that moment, Harold realized that true heroism wasn't about grand gestures or medals. It was about creating connections, inspiring others, and leaving the world a little better than you found it. And with that thought, Harold smiled, content in the knowledge that he had done exactly that.